It would be an honor to meet her even in the 3rd grade. Is it really true? The host continued to lead the ceremony. Then he announced that the student representatives would now take the oath of office. All the students had to stand up from their seats. When they stood up, Simon asked Rowan if this was the final part of the ceremony. He replied that it was. The top 2 students, a male and female student, would come up and take the oath. Simon was curious who they could be. The presenter continued that the students whose names he called would come to the podium. The second best student was Sernine Dark. And she walked up to the podium to the admiring gazes of the students. And then the number 1 best student was Simon Valencia. He did not even realize at first that his name had been called. The huge hall was silent. The host asked if Simon Valencia was even here. And then the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. What? Simon finally got up from his seat and walked to the stage to the whispers of students who did not understand who he was and why he was the number 1 student. They all looked at each other. He stood next to Sernine Dark, sweating with excitement. But then he decided to pull himself together, to stop being nervous and just read what he was told. Together with Cern, they raised their hands and began to recite the oath. After they said the oath, he went back to his seat and began to think. It was true when he was told that Kizen was a very intense school, he could never have imagined that they would keep the whole class together all day for the initiation ceremony. There were 14 groups with more than 1,000 new students and every group was full. After everyone found out that he was number 1 among the freshmen, everyone started whispering about him. No one had ever heard of him before, and no one had ever heard of his family with the last name Valencia either. Simon was very tense because of this. Simon started his first day of school very stressed, he was on pins and needles about how many lessons he had to have. It was a good thing he had written down his schedule in his notebook. Looking through it, he settled on summonology, which was the class he wanted to take the most. Because it was the type of magic his father had used. This meant that he would be able to be like his father if he took this course. But Simon's first lesson was on catarology, and it began with the students rattling their pens and writing down the teacher's introduction. The professor paced from side to side and said that some people associate necromancers with dark and gloomy images of handling corpses in the dark. But all this is in the past, modern necromancers are smart, practical, with a sense of style and trends. This is the new generation of necromancers, and this is how Bahil Amagar, a professor of catarology, started his career. He was a young star necromancer, a member of the Crow's Kizen's core battling group in his late 20s, and an idol of unrivaled popularity among Kizen students. He greeted everyone and explained that he would be teaching them catarology this year. The students were delighted and began to applaud him, he was a legend to them. Professor Bahil decided to start his class by checking attendance, and since they were probably seeing each other for the first time, he asked everyone to briefly introduce themselves when he called their name. And he called the first name Jamie Victoria, and a girl with green hair and glasses jumped out from behind the first desk raising her hand. She shouted that she was present and it was a great honor for her to meet him. She was going to become a specialist in catarology, following in the footsteps of the professor. But the professor stopped her with a wave of his hand. He advised her to introduce herself to her classmates, not to him, so let her try again. Jamie Victoria tried again, this time introducing herself to the students. Eventually it was Simon's turn, but as soon as he said his name and where he was from, everyone started whispering about him again. After him, another guy named Hector Moore introduced himself. When everyone had finished introducing themselves, the professor noticed that they were all full of charm, but they should start their lesson. He began to draw a fundamental question on the board with chalk. Why should they study catarology? And he broke the chalk on the board. He asked all the students in the classroom if any of them could say the definition of catarology as a subject, and Jamie Victoria immediately jumped up from her seat with her hand raised. She said quickly and memorized that it is a type of dark magic that retains its power by weakening the enemy. The professor praised her answer. But he noted that some of the students would not quite understand what he was talking about, so he would rather just say that catarology is about weakening the opponent. Then he started drawing them an example on the board. And then he continued, let's say that there are two knights with approximately the same skill level, they start to fight vigorously with swords. They try to tire each other out and wait for the opponent to make a mistake, they exchange about 20 blows, but neither of them gives up. Simon listens to the story with fascination. However, one knight starts shouting loudly at the other and looking at him with a murderous look. His opponent is frightened, trembling and turning pale with fear. Finally, the knight's sword cuts the opponent's shoulder. He begins to bleed and his movements slow down and shake. The other knight realizes that this is his chance to win. He corners the enemy and attacks his leg to make him unable to move. Then he throws sand in his eyes and hits him on the head to distract him and keep him off balance. The battle is getting tense and finally, the knight finally cuts off his opponent's head, which falls to the ground. The professor has put the final point in his scheme. He asked the students whether they now see that even the most primitive and barbaric battles with cold steel are simply a series of actions that weaken the opponent in order to gradually achieve victory. The students were delighted with how the professor was able to explain a complex term in an interesting way. Now he was going to show them how modern necromancers fight. Professor Bahil began to draw on the board again, he depicted a conventional person, and then voiced his rhetorical question, how a modern necromancer would defeat this person. And he began to move the chalk quickly across the board. Then he hit the chalk against the board, death by curse after the first movement. And the necromancer won. The students were delighted, but did not quite understand what had happened. The professor began to explain that a curse is the lightest and simplest structure among all types of dark magic, and its other characteristic is that it is quickly activated. Moreover, it is effective as a low effort, allowing you to completely shake and confuse your opponent. The professor took a few steps and came close to the boy's desk with a smile. He continued to look at him smiling for several seconds. The boy did not understand what was happening and smiled nervously back. At the same time, unbeknownst to him, the professor was cursing him. And in a moment, this student fell helplessly on his desk with a dull thud. The professor took the knife out of the student's bag and made a pretense of swinging. He said that this is how modern necromancers fight, and he pulled the knife towards the student and then put it away. All the students were delighted with the performance, except for that student. They shouted that it was so cool and that catarology was the best. The professor lifted his curse on that poor student with one snap of his fingers and continued his speech that he didn't want to know what subject they would choose to specialize in, but he dared to guess that more than 80% of them would choose his subject for the second semester. Simon was also excited about this class. He believed that catarology had the best compatibility with other subjects. The professor concluded his class by urging them to practice their specializations, but not to forget to curse their opponents whenever they have the opportunity. This will be the most effective way to win. He personally believes that catarology is the core of modern necromancy. The reason for this was that, having stopped, the teacher turned around and looked at the class, which was listening attentively to him and taking notes. Then with a sharp movement he revealed to the whole class the inscription he had written. Priests, this inscription was on the board, and that is why catarology was the most effective way of confronting their main enemies, with a serious voice explained the teacher, looking carefully at the class. Then turning to the students, some of whom looked at him with confusion, he asked them if necromancers had curses and priests had blessings. The difference was that one strengthened the target while the other weakened it. The question was to see when a curse was better than a blessing. The green-haired girl with glasses, who had been introduced earlier, jumped up from her seat, raising her hand in the air and calling her name again. Then she answered the question posed earlier by the professor, explaining that curses were quicker than blessings. Which meant that curses could accumulate a weakening effect on the target faster, which was a huge advantage in real combat. Hearing the girl's answer, the teacher rubbed his chin thoughtfully, saying that it was an interesting opinion. But then added that it was wrong. The girl who answered froze in place with a raised hand and a bewildered look on her face. Seeing that no one else was willing to answer, the teacher began his explanations. Beginning with the fact that if you consider only the speed of application, the scientists come to a consensus that the curses that are imposed through the resistance of the enemy, a little slower than the blessing of the priest. After finishing his explanation, the teacher asked if anyone had anything to add, and immediately a hand went up. The guy who raised his hand introduced himself as Hector Moore. Turning to the instructor, he replied that there was almost no one who trained in a weakened state. Intrigued by the boy's answer, the instructor looked at him with interest and then asked him to state his name again. After the yellow-haired boy repeated his name, the professor said that he would remember it, to which he sat down in his seat to the applause of the class. The professor continued the lecture, explaining that Hector's words were correct, because weakening spells really can't be blocked by training. Then the professor continued, saying that everyone when practicing is conditioned while in a normal state. And the measure of skills depends on how much and how well a person will train. It is also important to take into account all environmental factors and whether they are under our control. Raising his index finger up, the instructor emphasized that humans were more sensitive creatures than they appeared and could break even at the slightest change. In other words, you didn't need to take your entire arm away from an archer who was targeting you for victory. You just had to load his vision with conjunctivitis, make him nauseous and vomit, confuse his sense of distance and blur his vision, or simply divert his attention to another object while he escaped. With such simple and uncomplicated solutions, you could avoid the arrow flying at you, the teacher summarized. Then turning to the blackboard where the diagram was drawn, he said that necromancers have many ways to disrupt the state of the enemy. He then gave an example, saying that no one would practice to prepare for curses when they had a stomach ache or were tired. The instructor continued by saying that they could just take the day off. Hearing his words, the class chuckled. After waiting for the class to calm down, the teacher said that they should remember one important thing. And that was that they should think how to weaken others instead of thinking how to strengthen themselves, because the best defense is offense. The door opened, and 3 female assistants entered the classroom carrying boxes with the academy's emblem on them. After everyone had a set of what they would need for training, the teacher announced in a solemn voice that they would now have to learn how to cast curses on others. Simon, as you can see, was easily dumbfounded, because he couldn't believe they were learning dark magic in their first class. The teacher reminded the class that it should be a shame if a Kizen student used a proofreader, but made an allowance since it was the first class and also the first lesson. For Simon it was a shot in the eye, not in the eyebrow, because he was the one who used the corrector. The reason why the teacher didn't want the students to use it was because it was quite useful in mastering, but there was a risk of becoming addicted to it, so one had to be careful. Finished with the theory, the teacher clapped his hands and then turned to the class saying that now it was time to practice the curse of exhaustion. He then began to explain that the students had to hold on to the handles of the corrective device and squeeze their darkness into the pattern shape of the corrective device. He further explained that the key to successfully forming the perfect magic circle was the rune word, which was a set of letters possessing magical power. After that, the teacher raised his hand on which appeared a dark magical sign, around which there were many magical letters. After showing an example, he explained that writing the words of the rune with darkness causes magic. Seeing that everyone had finished creating magic circles, the teacher told everyone to raise them up. On top of the pattern of the magic circle that was on the device appeared another magic circle consisting of darkness. Simon was delighted to see this, as he had succeeded the first time. However, to Simon's surprise and incomprehension, the class was filled with cheers of students who managed to fulfill the teacher's task. In addition, his magic circle looked much more unreliable than the others and threatened to collapse at any second, which happened in the next moment. Noticing Simon's failure, the teacher explained that this happens if you don't refine the darkness properly or loosen the binding of the magic circle, and then he ordered the boy to try again, to which he nodded in response. Walking up the steps of the classroom, the instructor said that those who could keep the magic circle in the air would move on to actual practice. He added that everyone had to have a plant that was given with the corrective device. Simon went on to create a stable magic circle. To the students who succeeded, the teacher told them to aim at the plant on the table. Then use the curse on the poor plant that was just beginning to enjoy life. To the students who succeeded, the plant shriveled up and took on a sickly appearance. In the next second the plant dramatically fell on its back with its arms spread out, ending its not long but very useful life, which will serve for the formation of a new generation of necromancers. The teacher explained that if the plant had noticeable changes, it meant that the magic circle was working properly. The golden-haired boy saw that the plant had taken a lying position and did not look healthy at all and exclaimed joyfully. The teacher noted that he was beginning to see the difference in skills between the students. At the same time Simon once again tried to stabilize the magic circle, which despite all his attempts did not become more stable. The teacher did not pay attention to Simon, who failed to create a magic circle, turned to the other students, saying that if they succeeded, they should repeat it to practice the speed of creating a magic circle. Simon failed at creating a circle once again. He clutched the knobs of the corrective device in frustration. He couldn't understand what his problem was. And why he was the only one failing. The other students, having successfully completed the first step, began casting the curse on the plants. Simon could not help but wonder what he was doing wrong. But suddenly a phrase he had heard before popped into his head. When Lorraine and Nephthys looked at the cloud of darkness that had formed on his arm, they were amazed to see that it also had the properties of mana, and that it was swirling like a flame, which meant that it was in a vaporous state. Nephthys added that this was why he was entering the academy, to learn how to use his core effectively. Realizing that what Lorraine and Nephthys had said about him being very bad at operating mana was absolutely true, Simon decided to start with the basics in order to move from where he was stuck. Putting the device aside, he set his thoughts aside and concentrated only on the task at hand. Remembering Professor Bahil's words that the problem was either a lack of purification or a binding to the circle, he decided instead of sending the mana directly to the core, he would collect it as much as he needed. Then would send all the collected mana into the core at one time. Now that there was enough mana in the core, and his darkness was much stronger, all Simon had to do. So it was to pour his darkness back into the device and create a magic circle. As expected, it worked now, and the guy managed to form a perfect circle, which he immediately directed at the innocent plant, which had already given up hope that the guy would succeed. Fully prepared, Simon shouted a curse and activated the magic circle. He cast the curse on the plant, which immediately became painful and covered with a dark aura. Then he looked at his abuser one last time with resentment and tears in his eyes. The plant dramatically passed away. Simon couldn't be happy that he had finally succeeded, though not the first time. There was a man in the middle of the class who had been watching Simon closely all this time. Hector had been praised by the teacher and was one of the first to do the task. When he saw Simon's success, he clucked his tongue in annoyance. Clapping his hands to get the students' attention, the teacher said that that was all that applied to practice. As for those who failed, they would have to practice after they returned to the dormitories. Hearing the teacher's words, Simon breathed a sigh of relief as he was still able to complete the assignment, even though it was not the first time. However, Professor Bahil continued, saying that now they had to show what they had learned in this lesson. The teacher's words took Simon by surprise. The next moment the teacher noted with surprise that special admission number 1 was in this class. Then calling the name of the main character, he asked him to come forward. The eyes of the whole class were immediately directed at Simon, who, feeling uncomfortable, hesitantly agreed. The students, hearing that he was a special admission student, speculated about how good he would be. Professor Bahil decided that a special admission student needed a worthy opponent, so he decided to choose one from the students who had passed the entrance exam with impressive results. Calling Hector Moore's name, he asked him to step forward. Simon stood in the middle of the class opposite his tall and confident opponent and listened to the rules explained by the teacher. Simon and Hector were given corrective devices, and then Professor Bahil explained that they were only allowed to use the curse of exhaustion. The task was to create a magic circle and use it on the enemy. The first one to fail to stay on their feet would lose. After hearing the rules, Hector raised his hand, saying that he would compete without the corrective device. The professor nodded his head and praised him, saying that such an attitude was welcome. Looking at the boy, who was staring at his opponent with drained confidence, Professor Bahil noted to himself that he seemed quite intelligent for his weak bare form. Remembering his words about using the device being undesirable, he noted that the boy had remembered that and decided to impress him by demonstrating his skills. Turning to Simon, he asked if he was going to use the corrective device, to which he replied in an uncertain voice that he was. With a disdainful look at the protagonist, the professor said yes. The next moment, with a smile on his face, he raised his hand, saying that they could start as soon as he gave the command and also wishing them good luck. There was silence between Simon and Hector. Hector frowned at Simon, while the latter didn't feel very confident against such an experienced and formidable opponent. In the next second, Professor Bahil gave the command to start the contest. Holding the corrective device in his hands and beginning to release the darkness into her, he calmed himself, telling himself not to be nervous and just do it like last time. Assuring himself that if he tried hard enough he could do it. Suddenly, however, a previously unknown horrible feeling enveloped him. With a blurry look at his opponent, Simon couldn't believe his eyes. Hector freely steered the circle with one hand and pointed it at Simon. The students were surprised and praised how Hector was able to create a circle so quickly without a device. The boy held the circle in one hand and looked at the hall with a satisfied face. Simon didn't know what to do, as not only was he creating a circle slower than his opponent even with the device, but the mere hitting of his opponent made him feel very tired. Deciding not to wonder, Simon raised the device in front of him and resumed creating the circle. However, just like last time, his circle was very unstable and began to collapse. He decided that such a circle would be useless even if he managed to use it on his opponent, and having destroyed the circle himself, he decided to start from scratch. The next moment he felt tired again and almost collapsed to the ground. Noticing that Simon had not given up and was trying to keep fighting, Hector used the curse on him again. But it didn't end once like last time. This time he continued to use the curse on the protagonist over and over again. The rest of the students looked at this scene with confusion. Stopping at 5 iteration, Hector said that should be enough. Barely able to stay on his feet, Simon could hear the chatter of a student who wondered with disdain if he was really number one once unable to start a single spell. Turning to Simon, who was breathing heavily, Hector told him to give up, adding that he was pathetic to look at. Not seeing that the guy was going to give up, Hector asked irritably if he wanted to see how it ended. He used another curse that was noticeably stronger than the previous ones, causing Simon to groan in pain and clench his teeth. As Professor Bahil watched the contest from the sidelines, he pondered the potential of the contestants. Concluding that Hector was a gem that did not lie in the road, besides his talent, he also possessed the mindset of a Kizen student. He would most likely become an outstanding student who could survive to the 3rd grade. On the other hand, a special admission number 1 who had no prior training or basic knowledge of dark magic, let alone any real experience. Professor Bahil couldn't help but wonder why Nephthys had chosen this particular boy. Numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, who are officially invited into Kizen without passing preliminary exams, are supposed to be talents that are born once every few centuries. Especially number 1, who was always chosen by Nephthys herself and was bound to achieve outstanding results in his field. However, in the guy he was looking at now, he did not at all see the potential that was supposed to be in a person called the most talented. Looking at Simon, who despite his opponent's numerous attacks continued to stand on his feet, Bahil speculated that perhaps his specialty was stamina. Since normal students of his age kneel down after the 4th graduation, but he continued to stay on his feet even after the 9th graduation. Furthermore, he continued to maintain the magic circle while it was incredibly difficult for him to just stay awake, which was a testament to the fact that his spirit was also incredibly strong. But unfortunately that wasn't what was needed to pass the test, as magic combat professors valued physical and mental strength, so his specialty had nothing to do with it. But to his surprise, Simon, despite all the weakening curses placed on him, not only managed to stay on his feet, but also managed to complete the magic circle. After which, he shouted the exhaust spell. He released a weakening curse directly at Hector, who did not expect such a repulse from an opponent who could hardly stand on his feet. Bahil's teacher froze in place with admiration on his face, unable to believe what he had just seen. Simon was also glowing with happiness, even though he was only able to land a single blow. Holding his hand to the floor, Hector couldn't believe what had just happened. Nor could he believe that such an exhaust power could even exist. Not even during the prep session had this happened. Unwilling to accept that he could be attacked at all, he promised himself that he would never miss another spell again, and that he would end this annoying fight right now. Creating a new spell, he furiously shouted an exhaust spell and used it on Simon, who groaned painfully. The next moment, the adjustment device fell to the floor, followed by the defeated Simon, who had no strength to stand. The match was over, and Professor Bahil congratulated Hector on his victory with a smile on his face, but Hector didn't look happy about the victory, even though the whole class was cheering and shouting his name. Then turning to Simon, who was still on his knees, and having removed the effects of the weakening, the teacher also praised him, saying that he had done a great job and was able to show a great match. He then clapped his hands and announced the end of today's class. At the end of the class, one of the students approached Bahil and said that she had some questions about today's lecture. To which he replied that she should come to his office after today's class and he would answer all her questions. Hearing this, the girl glowed with joy and thanked the professor. Bahil, however, told himself that he couldn't lose such a precious moment for the sake of some frivolous girl. Simon Valencia, said Bahil alone standing in the middle of the empty classroom. That last release he was able to make at the end, it was far more valuable than the 9 exhausts Hector performed. That was the best strike, muttered Bahil with a delighted smile on his face. That genius should specialize in catarrhology by all means. Walking down the corridor, Simon felt very tired, as did the plant, which turned out to be more resilient than expected. Simon sank down in his chair and sighed heavily, then rested his forehead against the desk. He wondered why all the classes at the academy were so difficult. The blonde guy who sat down at his table said that it was because he was the first special admissions. Simon asked in confusion what that had to do with his classes being so hard. The guy explained that at Kizen there was tough competition not only among students, but also among professors. Incompetent professors could be fired even in the middle of a semester, and there were cases when the monthly salary suddenly changed. But those who show great results have great influence in the academy. Simon asked what he was getting at. The guy continued, saying that it was because of the competition that all the professors were trying to recruit good students, and now they just had to turn on their brains and think about what would happen if there was a student who was rated as the most talented. It finally dawned on the boy that the professor had called him in front of the class to test his skills. Confirming Simon's speculation, the blonde-haired guy also mentioned about the girl who was called his colleague. Even though it was hard for Simon to think in his condition, he could still remember that her name was Malin Willen. The boy said that Simon was right, adding that she was the best in the whole course, so it was easy to see how good he was compared to her. But that didn't cheer Simon up one bit, since he'd never been able to beat her, and even Hector could barely cast a single spell. The light-haired boy replied that that was why all the professors were confused, because they expected him to be a genius, but in fact he turned out to be a novice. After understanding the explanation, Simon turned to the guy and thanked him, and then with a nonchalant face asked for his name. This question made the blonde-haired boy resentful, as he couldn't understand how Simon couldn't remember his name, which he had told him during Professor Bahil's class. Then he added loudly that his name was Dick Hayward, and that he was in the same class as Simon. Standing up from the table, Dick asked Simon about the talk that was going on about him. Realizing what he was talking about, the protagonist replied that they were probably talking about the fact that he was probably not so special anymore. Dick laughed and replied that he shouldn't take it to heart, because it was normal to be himself, and he also didn't understand what all the fuss was about on the first day. Then he noted that even though it was only noon, Simon looked exhausted. He grinned and replied that it was because he had used up all his stamina in Professor Bahil's class. Remembering that his new friend had gotten 10 curses at a time, Dick agreed that it was probably normal to be exhausted after that. It was fun, though. This phrase shocked the blonde-haired boy, who stared at Simon in surprise. The same one glowing with joy said that although it was a bit difficult, the class itself was fun. Leaning over to Simon, who was looking at him in bewilderment, Dick wagged his finger at him, saying that he was strange because it couldn't be fun, then added that that wasn't their main problem right now. Then whispered that Hector had already started forming his clique. Not understanding anything, Simon asked what he was talking about. Dick pointed to Hector, who was being introduced by a boy, and explained that he had impressed a lot of the guys in Professor Bahil's class, so it wasn't surprising that there was a lot of excitement about him. He was also the eldest son of an influential family, which made him popular among the noble children. But all this information did not interest Simon, who indifferently replied that he was not interested. But Dick was not going to be so easy to ask, and approaching Simon he said emotionally that politics was also important. Then he asked Simon if he knew what would happen if the whole class fell under Hector's influence. Those who would lose their favor with him would be outcasts, as well as unable to find team members for the group. Realizing that Dick was well versed in politics, Simon asked him why he had come to him and not to Hector. He scratched the back of his head and replied that he was a commoner from a merchant family. Simon was surprised, for he had heard that everyone was treated equally at Kizen. Dick grinned and replied that it was true. But unfortunately there were still some children from noble families who wanted to show their superiority. Hearing this, Simon replied that at least he was not, which pleased Dick, who was about to offer him something. "Join my group, Simon," said Dick enthusiastically, pointing a finger at himself. Then he assured Simon that whether you lacked skills or were told you had them, he was special admission number 1. In addition, kids who took the prep courses might seem better in class now, but with time, if you worked hard, things would even out. And there was no way Nephthys would pick him for nothing. Then, pointing his finger at Simon, Dick said excitedly that, to put it another way, he was hiding talents that even he didn't know he had. There was an awkward pause. After which Simon replied with a laugh. That he couldn't say anything about joining his band yet. But smiling and holding out his hand to Dick, Simon suggested that they start with friendship. The offer seemed to surprise the boy. He waved his hands and said that in Kizen it was a very awkward word that was rarely heard, adding that it sounded cringeworthy. But seeing that Simon was serious and not even joking, he scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Then, holding out his hand in return, Dick replied that it would be nice to have a friend, and Simon agreed. Dick said that they would soon be leaving again for the next C class. Simon agreed and asked what the next class would be. Dick looked at the schedule and said that it was summonology. This news made Simon very happy, which made him glow with happiness. For now he could summon creatures on his own, just as his father had done. Hopefully, he and Dick headed to the next class. As Simon climbed the stairs in search of empty seats, he heard conversations that mocked him, calling him the biggest failure in Kizen's history. Hector's jackal sitting next to him mockingly mentioned that he was also said to be better than Cerna, Châtel, and Lorraine, mockingly adding that it was bullshit. Hector just stared at Simon in silence, not saying a word. Dick sat down next to Simon and told him not to pay attention to them, because they just wanted to assert themselves at the expense of others. But the protagonist did not care. His only desire and the object of all his attention was the draft class, and all he did was to stare at one point with the look of a fool in love, waiting for the class to begin. Watching this, Dick could not help noting that his new friend was rather strange. Suddenly footsteps were heard in the corridor. At the same time Simon could not understand why his friend called him strange, for no one had ever said such things to him before, to which he replied that from now on he would hear part of it. At the same time a man came into the hall yawning, his appearance did not match the professor's, and the students began to whisper, wondering who it could be. The man walked to the table and put his hands on it. Then raised his head and introduced himself as Arandia, their recruitment teacher for this semester. Then without changing his tone he began his lecture, beginning by saying that summonology was the root of all necromancers, as well as their history. Starting to write something in chalk on the blackboard, he continued, telling the bewildered students that even though the scholars did not recognize it, that necromancers were descended from thieves of Thrun, gravediggers, and other similar occupations. Pointing behind him to the blackboard where the single word summonology was written in chalk, he continued, saying that if the students had ears, they had probably heard many stories about summonology. Lagging behind the times, badly treated, hard to learn, lots of flaws and nuances, he said. Exactly the kind of prejudices you might have heard towards necromancers, said Professor Aaron. However, most of them are true, he added, contrary to all the expectations of the students who were shocked by his words, to the last hoping that he would say that they were all just rumors. However, the reality turned out to be cruel. A murmur went through the class, as the students did not understand how the professor of the draft could say such things. However, the professor, who looked more like a common warrior than a teacher, went on to say that they must have enjoyed all the previous classes, as the professors had only told them the delights of their specialty. However, he said he didn't support that attitude, adding that he thought everyone should know both the pros and cons of a specialization in order to make the right decision. Therefore, he started with the disadvantages, which surprised the students who had encountered it for the first time. The first disadvantage was that it was expensive, and no matter how much you calculate it, it still comes out to be several times more costly. The materials fee for conscription can be several times more than for all other specialties combined. This price for materials is due to the fact that suitable materials were not very common, but that was no reason to kill people or animals to get materials. Therefore, in modern times, summoners use skeleton kits or specially processed corpses for summoning. He went on to explain that most often summoners spent more money on materials than they received in reward for the mission, so he advised students who were going to study summonology not to expect to earn money. And the second drawback was that the summoner depended heavily on summoned creatures, because if you think about it, summonology is all about battles with summoned creatures. But when the summoner's creatures are destroyed, the summoner's power is drastically reduced by more than 80%. Part of the problem was the first drawback, but these days summoners are more likely to use a semi-permanent remade undead rather than a disposable one. If they lose these semi-permanent undead, they suffer both strategic and financial damage. Until they rebuild their summoned creature or replace it with a new one, they can only watch from the sidelines as their counterparts fight. The third and most important disadvantage was that the summoners were weak against the priests, to be precise. Summonology was no match for modern howling, and that was no joke. The time when summonology could fully realize its potential was total war, as during battles summoners get an unlimited supply of materials for summoning undead, because dead bodies could be found literally everywhere. But even after the truce, modern warfare continues in the form of small localized battles. And for such quick and traceless battles best suited mages who specialized in curses, as well as spirit controllers. While necromancy was very weak against priests, who could destroy the entire army with a single holy spell, which was very inefficient, as the cost of recovery would be enormous. After telling the disadvantages, the professor added that there were a few more, but in any case the choice was left to the students. As soon as he finished, Jamie immediately raised her hand, calling out to the professor. Having introduced herself, she asked with interest, "So what were the advantages of summonology?" The professor looked at the girl with a frown. He replied that he didn't remember allowing her to ask questions, which took the girl by surprise, and she confusedly sat down and apologized. Advantages. The number as well as the possibility of applying different tactics in battle using summoned creatures. Without enthusiasm in his voice replied the professor, which sounded like he was omitting too many advantages, and in general was not interested to interest the students. Without naming more advantages, he turned to the students and said that only they should decide whether to take summonology in the second semester or not, but added that they should not forget one thing. Don't even dream of setting foot in this field if you don't have the guts for it. After this motivational speech, the professor added that if anyone is going to cry, whine, turn away or consult him about changing their major after the second year for financial reasons or whatever, they shouldn't even consider majoring in that field with such a characterless mindset. As the students listened to his words, they looked at him in confusion. The assistants, who had already listened to these words apparently not for the first time, sighed tiredly. The professor did not stop, saying that if someone hopes to specialize in summonology only because there is less competition for survival, I will personally expel you. Okay, that's it, let's get to class. To which the class tentatively agreed. Simon picked up a box with unknown contents, which was provided by his assistants, and listened to the professor's instructions, who explained that these boxes contained the bones of sharp-blooded rat catchers. Opening the lid, the guy saw a lot of different bones that were signed and sorted into compartments. The choice towards rat bones was justified by the similarity to human body structure, making it cheaper and easier than normal human skeletons. Tossing one of the skulls into the air with his hand, the instructor explained that most beginning summoners start with island rat bones. Pointing to a poster that the assistant was trying to hang on the wall at the time, he explained that it was the Pied Piper's bone structure. Then deciding to start practicing, he ordered everyone to pull out skull number 1. Adding for them the skull was already assembled by default. One of the girls took the skull in her hands and remarked that it was quite creepy, to which the other girl replied that despite that it was very clean. Seeing that most of the students had already examined the skulls, the professor told the students to put their hand through the hole that was located right under the skull. There should be a magical corrective circle inside. He added that it was exactly where they should put their hand and activate the magic circle. Simon held the skull in his hands and followed the professor's commands. Soon the boy managed to find the hole where the magic circle was located, which was supposed to work as a corrector, and then he stretched out his hand, deciding to try. Once the magic circle is complete. But he didn't have time to finish, as the next moment there were squeals and frightened screams from the students around the classroom. Who, without listening to the end, activated the circles, causing the heads of the island rat catchers to come to life and start wreaking havoc around the classroom. While the students, obviously unprepared for such a turn, were frightened, not realizing what was going on. The professor smirked as if he hadn't seen this coming and said that he was going to tell them not to be frightened by the fact that the undead would come back to life after the activation. But unfortunately he was too late, to which there were angry voices from the class saying that it was rather cruel and low. Simon, who had also activated the skull, ordered him not to move, which he immediately did. Seeing that Simon had been able to calm the skull so quickly, and that he was treating it as something ordinary, Dick asked if he had ever experienced such things before. To which Simon replied that he'd just seen them a lot before. With a loud clap on the table to attract attention, the professor told the students to get used to it, as they were necromancers, and then added that once the magic circle was activated, the process of creating undead could be considered complete. Since the head couldn't move on its own, it needed to create a body, and for that, necromancers needed to be familiar with the bone structure of the summoned creature. Unlike the human body which had 206 bones, the body of the island ratcatcher only had 53 bones, which was much simpler. Following the instructions of the professor, who said to take the number 2 neck bone and connect it to the skull, Simon found the right bone and began to carefully bring it to the skull. Suddenly the bone, like a magnet, jumped out of the guy's hand and stuck to the skull. The professor explained that skeletons have a tendency to return to their original form, and therefore, if you follow certain rules, the assembly should not be difficult, to which Simon replied in surprise that it was, while the skull of Dick, who decided that the head of his summoner was not necessary, tried to correct this misunderstanding. The professor continued to explain what to do, saying that now they should move on to bones number 3, 4, and so on up to 11. The students, despite the fact that it was not the easiest thing to do, followed his instructions with interest, and also consulted with each other. But not everyone had a good time, because some of them, before hearing the professor's warning to be careful not to mix up the bones of the upper back with the lower bones, which was very important, had already made this mistake, which again led to incidents with rodents, which, out of control, began to attack the innocent neighbors of those who had managed to mix up the bones. The professor said that if the creature is assembled incorrectly, it will not move smoothly. And in some cases it could break in the most important places at the most crucial moment. Hector folded his arms on his chest without showing any emotion, sitting in front of his perfectly assembled undead, while his minions sucked up to him praising him and telling him that he was the best. While the rest of the students following the professor's instructions were at 16 dice, Malin finished assembling her undead and sat with a bored look. Soon most of the students were able to get to bone 53, which was almost the end. The professor told the students not to be silent and to raise their hand if they were stuck somewhere and didn't know what to do. Immediately after his words, several students raised their hands to say that they were not doing well. At the same time he finished his first skeleton, which he had created with the help of his darkness. Simon smiled contentedly at his creation as he heard the voice of his new friend calling helplessly for him. Pointing to his undead, which was sitting on the table in a strange pose, Dick tearfully asked Simon why his skeleton was always trying to put a leg bone in his hand. After a glimpse of the undead, Simon pointed to the shoulder joint, adding that he had probably placed the leg bone where the arm bone should have been, which made the summoned creature move so strangely. Dick looked at his undead more closely and was surprised to see that Simon was right, then grumbled about why the bones were so similar. After a while, Professor Aaron announced that the time for collecting skeletons had been exhausted, adding that there would now be a demonstration of what they had gone through in class. As expected, he called Simon first, who had already accepted his fate and nodded obediently. Dick patted him on the back and wished him luck. The next student to be called by the teacher was Hector Moore. Hector Moore, whom he also summoned to come to the front of the class. Once again standing opposite each other and keeping their eyes on each other, they listened attentively to the teacher, who informed them that they had 10 minutes until the end of the class. Then he began to explain the essence of the competition, which was to collect the skeleton of his undead and using it to get a necklace. The winner will be the one who at the end of the class and will have a necklace. He also said that they could not take it with their hands and use dark magic, except for these 2 rules everything else was allowed. After the professor finished explaining the rules he told the guys to get ready and start as soon as he gave the command, after which they immediately knelt down and opened the box of bones. As soon as Professor Aaron gave the sign, the boys immediately grabbed a skull each of their future summoned creatures. Holding the skull in his hands, Simon told himself with a smile on his face that he could definitely win. After activating the magic seal, he decided to start with the spine and then move on to the other parts. Holding the skull in his hand, Simon looked at the board where the mouse skeleton structure was supposed to hang. However, to his surprise he found that one of the assistants had already started to remove it from the board. Noticing the boys' puzzled look, Professor Aaron explained that in this match was not allowed to cheat, and peeking at the skeletal structure was just that. The boys were quite shocked by this news. Despite the fact that the scheme was unavailable, Simon still had hope for the numbers that were labeled all the bones, which greatly simplified the task. So he immediately decided to collect everything in order, starting with number 1. But the next moment, to his confusion, he discovered that the bones had no numbers on them, contrary to his expectations. Seeing Simon's confusion, the teacher Aaron explained that of course there were no numbers on the real bones, and the ones they used for training were training bones, adding that it was only through the teacher's hard work that they could use the bones with numbers for training. Then he asked Simon in a cold voice, "Didn't I already tell you that? A necromancer should be familiar with all of this." Hector was the first to start assembling his skeleton. He was concentrating on putting the bones together according to the way he had memorized them, and he was doing quite well. Meanwhile, Simon could not quickly recover from the lack of clues he had received earlier, but he was not going to give up and was serious. He convinced himself that since he was able to put it together last time, he should be able to do it this time. He just needed to recall the sequence of the main bones. Simon started with bone number 2, which was supposed to be attached to the skull. Professor Aaron silently watched the student's attempts without expressing any emotion. It seemed that he was interested in very few things in life, and teaching students was definitely not on that list. But he still watched the students, and it seemed that special admission number 1 had never assembled a skeleton in his life, and now he would not succeed. While the other student, a big boy, had memorized the order and structure of the skeleton and had already completed it. The professor noticed that he relied on his knowledge and memory, and the preparatory courses he took before the class helped him with this, but he also avoided critical mistakes thanks to his intuition. He definitely had a bit of talent, but as far as special admission number 1 goes, he almost broke down. It was obvious that he hadn't taken the preparatory courses, and the professor didn't understand why. Simon, meanwhile, was hesitating whether he was picking up the bones in the right order or not. Professor Aaron looked at the students watching the competition and thought that only Hector seemed to have a bit of talent in this class. Hector was the first to get his island mouse skeleton to stand on its own 2 feet. As the students cheered, he thought he was going to win. He had almost completely assembled the skeleton, only the arms were left. Hector thought that since he was the first to assemble the skeleton, the victory was in his hands, and after that Simon would never have a chance against him again. His rodent skeleton was already completely ready. He looked at Simon with a strong desire to make him a laughingstock in front of the whole class, destroying his credibility and his reputation as the #1 special admission. And with an angry gnashing of his teeth, he added quietly to himself that he wanted to watch Simon fall to the floor. Hector didn't waste a minute and set his skeleton on the target. And step by step, he approached the table with the decoration. To the delighted shouts of the students, Hector's mouse jumped onto the professor's desk. The mouse immediately ran to the necklace. Then it immediately ran with the jewelry in its paws to its owner. Simon saw all this and realized that he had 5 minutes left before the bell rang, and if Hector still had the necklace, he would win. Simon could not let that happen. He continued to assemble his skeleton with trembling hands. Simon thought he couldn't jump in over his head, since Hector was more prepared and he had only assembled the skeleton once before, the chances of winning it were slim. His only way to win was to give up trying in vain to do what he was taught in class. He wouldn't succeed anyway. He just had to trust his own gut feeling, and he smashed what he had tried to put together before without success. Simon was just going to put the bones back together the way he imagined and felt. The students started whispering in surprise and seemed to be asking, "What is this? What is he doing? Did he start all over again wrong? Maybe he's giving up." Gradually, their whispers turned into mockery. They said that he had no talent or inner sense. Simon did not pay attention to them. His new friend Dick was very worried about him, while the other students did not understand why he was #1. Simon reflected that when the professor announced the rules, he said to get the necklace using the skeleton, not to make the skeleton perfect, so all was not lost for him. He had no time. He had to forget about complex structures and make his skeleton as simple as possible. He began to assemble the new skeleton and started by adding the front legs, which he remembered were #20. Then he added part #27, because it was the main part, and it went very quickly. He skipped some parts, put others in the wrong places. The professor noticed his attempts and wondered what he was doing. Then he looked closely and was very surprised. How could this be? It was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. The professor could not believe that Simon had done it and how he had managed to do it at all. It was the bone structure of a grey rat. And its eyes were burning with Simon's midnight darkness. The grey rats were the ancestors of the rat men who now lived on the island. And he was able to do this because they had similar bone structures, but the grey rats were much simpler in structure. Professor Aaron could not believe that he was able to recreate another creature simply by rearranging the bones. Of course, the skeleton was not exactly the same, but it was definitely an undead thing that could move. The professor was beginning to realize what Simon had done and was very impressed that a student with no training could do it. How could he come to this conclusion based on his gut instinct instead of knowledge? The professor was beginning to understand why he was the #1 choice of Nephthys. Meanwhile, Simon's friends were supporting him fiercely, telling him not to stop and to keep going. The mood of the students in the classroom also began to change. They no longer considered him a complete loser, although they did not quite understand what was happening. Only the upstart Jamie Victoria kept saying that she had made the perfect skeleton, and he was not acting according to the rules. But the smarter students realized that the shape didn't matter. Even those who were the first to assemble their training skeletons without looking at the diagram realized that they could not have done it that way. And all the students were on Simon's side and supporting him, which was very annoying for Hector, who believed that he should be the center of attention. He was furious and did not understand why everyone was supporting his rival. With all his anger, he directed his skeleton at the mutant that Simon had made. His skeleton remained intact due to its greater mass and more complete structure, while the other one was shattered. Hector looked at Simon's confused face and mentally proclaimed himself the winner. He was sure he had won and smiled smugly. But something was very wrong. Simon was smiling instead of being sad. He made a quick movement with his hand. And parts of his skeleton flew into the air, taking the necklace with them. The paw of his skeleton pulled the necklace off his opponent with a loud thud. The confused Hector did not have time to react and his unwilling servant stood there frozen. A paw of bones clutching the necklace flew toward Simon. And then the bell suddenly rang, first once. Then again. Hector didn't understand what had happened. The victory was in his hands, how could he lose? He said it was not fair and demanded that the professor stop this nonsense. After all, he had said at the beginning of the competition that you had to get the necklace using a skeleton, and it was just a piece of bone. Hector was shocked and furious. But Simon interrupted his whining with a surprised question, just a bone? Hector flinched. Simon said he didn't think so and made a confident movement with his hand. Suddenly, with a crash, the parts of his skeleton began to come together. Hector watched in horror as part by part, bone by bone, Simon's undead body came together on its own. It was the first time he had seen this. A moment later, the whole skeleton stood in front of him again. Simon asked him, "So what now, is it really just a bone?" The necklace remained in the skeleton's mouth. On the orders of its master, the skeleton spat the necklace right into his hands. And he raised the necklace right in front of Hector's face, laughing in his face. Furious, Hector could barely contain himself and gritted his teeth to keep from lashing out at Simon. But they were stopped by the professor, who said enough is enough. As usual, he tiredly began to announce the winner, and it was Simon Valencia. At first Simon hesitated for a second, but then he quickly grabbed his skeleton and picked it up. And he raised it above his head in front of the whole class. He was very happy. Simon was sincerely happy to win with his skeleton. He finally won, and not to be disgraced as he usually was before. After the first day of school was over, the professors met to discuss the students' results, and they started by saying that everyone agreed that there were many capable students enrolled this year. The special recruitment students and those who got the highest marks in the entrance exams were the best, especially Malin Villeneuve, who was even better than expected. She was able to do Shanif poison on the first try. It was impressive. The other teachers completely agreed with this opinion, and one of them added that the blood of the Villian family is thicker than water. All 7 children from this family have incredible abilities. Then they mentioned the heiress of the Ivory Tower, Saren, who also showed excellent results, and it was clear why her parents were so proud of her. Châtel Mayer was not forgotten either, as he completely broke the stereotypical notions of half-giants, as there was a prejudice that they had no magical skills at all, but this was not true at all, and Châtel was very capable in the field of specialization of magic. Professor Bahil mockingly asked them if they had already chosen their favorites and reminded them that it was forbidden to force students to specialize during the protected period for newcomers. But they did not respond to his words, instead asking how his class went today. Bahil asked with an innocent smile what they meant. But they told him not to pretend, and that he knew they wanted to hear about special admission number 1, whom Naftis had personally selected. He shrugged and calmly replied that the student had lost 10-1 to another student in the class, and he was not at all convinced that he had much talent. The other professors reacted with some restraint, saying that this was not expected, but he was still special admission number 1, so was he sure that there was nothing special about him? Professor Bahil pretended to think about it and then added that he had good stamina, having endured 9 curses of exhaustion before he collapsed in his first class. The other professors were not at all pleased. 9 times is certainly a lot and stamina is good, but not at all impressive for special admission number 1. While everyone was discussing the students, Professor Aaron, as usual, was bored on the sidelines. Unfortunately for him, Bahil noticed him and told him that he was also teaching a class today, wasn't he? Aaron was in no hurry to answer and calmly poured himself some tea. Then he turned to them and said that yes, he was teaching the class. But this answer did not satisfy Bahil at all, and he asked him directly what he thought about special admission number 1. Aaron realized that he couldn't avoid answering, so he said that in his opinion special admission number 1 is a slow mediocre guy, but he has a little originality to make some creative though defective designs. Bahil's hand with the cup trembled from this answer, although no one noticed. Everyone started whispering and discussing that the number 1 special admission was not so special this year and wondered how that could be, since it was chosen by Neftis herself. Bahil couldn't believe what had just happened. It seemed that only he had noticed it, so Aaron had put up a smokescreen in front of everyone and not said everything, which could only mean one thing. Aaron was known to be a complicated person, and such a statement from him meant only one thing: he liked special admission number 1 very much. Bahil knew it for sure. After all, a slow and mediocre guy with originality in making creative defective designs. It was the best compliment Aaron could give. Bahil continued to think, the guy chosen by Nephthys and set on by the fastidious Aaron was becoming more and more interesting to Bahil, and he had a desire to play with Aaron for a while. He approached him and the latter turned to him with a questioning look. Bahil asked about the statement he had made last year, did he still stand by it? Aaron did not understand what he was talking about and asked again, last year? Yes, that statement that Aaron was no longer going to directly mentor students. Bahil said it with a seemingly friendly and innocent smile, but Aaron understood what was behind the question and lost all his confidence. He started to stammer out an excuse that he didn't mean it, when suddenly, bam! Nephthys herself joyfully burst into the room, greeting everyone there. Immediately, all conversations stopped and everyone bowed their heads in respect to her, and she continued to greet them carefree as if they were not her subordinates, just friends. Bahil took out an ice cream from his magic pocket and was about to give it to Nephthys with a smile. She kind of exclaimed in surprise that she was surprised and had already told him to stop spoiling her like a child, but nevertheless reached out for the ice cream. Bahil told her that the virtue of being a gentleman included preparing snacks for a lady. Nephthys was pleased, waiting for the opportunity to taste her gift, and said what a smooth talker he was, and she just had to take this ice cream since she was given it. The other professors were shocked that he was carrying around